So imagine you're looking at humanity through like an fMRI scanner right now. Not a single person, but our entire species.
Like operating as one giant interconnected brain.
Exactly. One massive global brain. And if you look at the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic, tool building, complex problem solving is absolutely glowing.
Oh, yeah. It'd be blindingly bright on the skin.
Right. It's hyperdeveloped. I mean, we are splitting the atom, we're editing the genetic code of living organisms, and we're building artificial intelligence that can literally mimic human thought.
The sheer cognitive processing power we've achieved as a collective is just staggering.
It really is. But then you look at the amygdala on this exact same global brain scan.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. The amygdala, which is that ancient almond-shaped cluster responsible for basic emotional regulation, fear, tribal threat response. On our species-wide scan, that part is stunted.
Totally shriveled.
It's completely shriveled. It's operating exactly as it did 100,000 years ago. The juxtaposition there is, well, it's a diagnostic nightmare.
It is the ultimate diagnostic mismatch. Because, think about it, if you have this hyper-developed capacity to create tools of unimaginable power, but an underdeveloped capacity to emotionally regulate how you actually use those tools, you are looking at a system that is mathematically destined to destroy itself.
And that terrifying biological and sociological scan is exactly what we are jumping into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
So for you listening, you have handed us an incredibly dense, provocative document to explore today. It's the Peaceful World Manifesto version 1.0.
It's quite the read.
It is. But specifically, per the guidelines of this deep dive, we are going to meticulously unpack and analyze only the preamble of this document.
Which is actually a brilliant constraint, honestly.
Why do you say that?
Well, because in most political or, philosophical texts, a preamble is just throat clearing.
Right. We the people, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's usually a few lofty platitudes about liberty or justice before you get to the actual rules. But the authors of this manifesto treat their preamble completely differently. They treat it as the foundational source code.
The source code, I like that.
Yeah, it doesn't just say, hey, we want peace. It attempts to diagnose the existential, neurological, and sociological problem of humanity. And then it lays down this multidisciplinary biological foundation for a solution.
And then surprisingly, it outlines a highly technical, almost corporate methodology for achieving world peace.
Which is wild. It reads less like a political declaration and more like the architecture for a new social operating system.
It really does. But before we get completely lost in the philosophical and technical weeds here, I want to establish exactly why you, the listener, should even care about a manifesto preamble.
That's a fair question.
Because let's be honest, world peace is a phrase that usually makes smart, pragmatic people roll their eyes.
Oh, absolutely. It sounds naive.
Yeah.
It sounds like something printed on a bumper sticker from the 1970s.
Exactly. We live in a world where every single day we wake up and we accept massive, devastating tragedies.
We do.
We accept war, systemic violence, the organized slaughter of thousands of lives as a necessary evil. We literally price it into the cost of doing business as a human species on Earth.
We barely even blink at the headlines anymore.
Right. And the reason this preamble matters to you, sitting in traffic or maybe cooking dinner right now, is that it aggressively challenges that core assumption.
It really takes a hammer to it.
It argues that accepting war as an inevitable reality isn't just cynical. In an age of godlike weaponry, it is a biological death sentence.
It forces a really profound confrontation with our own complacency. It asks whether our current acceptance of violence is actually biological inevitability, meaning like we are just doomed by our DNA.
Right.
Or if it is simply a deeply entrenched cultural habit, a glitch in our societal software that we've allowed to run wild.
And if it's a software glitch, the preamble demands we ask how exactly we patch it before the hardware, our entire planet is destroyed.
So let's trace the logic of this diagnosis. The text introduces a concept to explain this glitch. And it's a framing I just haven't been able to stop thinking about.
Oh, the Promethean gap.
Yes, the Promethean gap. It is a beautifully terrifying term.
It really is. So in Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity.
Right. And fire is the ultimate metaphor for technology. It warms us. It allows us to forge tools and cook food. It fundamentally alters our evolutionary trajectory.
But fire is entirely agnostic to morality.
Exactly. It will just as happily burn down your entire village as it will warm your hearth.
And the gap, as the preamble defines it, is that chasm between our capacity to invent the fire and our capacity to actually comprehend the consequences of the fire.
Precisely. It's the psychological and ethical lag. Humanity's ability to manufacture technologies and unleash forces has grown exponentially.
Hockey stick growth, yeah.
But our ability to emotionally or morally imagine the consequences of those forces has remained relatively static.
I mean, we can build a thermonuclear warhead.
Yes. But the human brain cannot actually viscerally comprehend the suffering of 10 million people vaporized in an instant. The math is just too big for our empathy to scale.
That void between creation and comprehension, that is the Promethean gap.
And the preamble anchors this gap in a very specific three-part structural diagnosis of our society. It calls it an evolutionary mismatch.
Right, I want to get into this.
Yeah.
It claims that humanity is currently operating with Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology.
It is the perfect storm.
It really is.
If we break that down mechanically, the Paleolithic emotions refer to our neurochemistry. Evolution is brutally slow.
Super slow.
Our fight-or-flight responses, our tribal in-group, out-group biases, our immediate physiological reactions to perceived threats, these were all forged on the savannah hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Right, where a hyper-reactive us versus them mentality actually kept you alive.
Exactly. If a rival tribe approached your water source, you didn't host a diplomatic summit. You fought, because resources were a zero-sum game back then.
So our hardware is optimized for a world that simply doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
We have a biological operating system designed to manage a tribe of maybe 50 to 150 people.
Dunbar's number, right?
Yeah, Dunbar's number. And we are trying to use it to manage a globalized population of 8 billion.
And that leads directly to the second part of the mismatch, the medieval institutions.
Okay, walk me through that.
So we took those Paleolithic brains, and over a few thousand years, we built massive, complex societies. But the primary mechanisms we used to govern these societies on a global scale, the absolute sovereignty of the nation-state, rigid territorial borders, the centralized authority that claims a monopoly on legitimate violence.
The right to wage war.
Exactly. These concepts were largely codified in the medieval and early modern periods. Think of, like, the Peace of Westphalia in the 1600s.
Right.
Our global governance is essentially a scaled-up version of a feudal castle system. It's hierarchical, it's rigid, and it's obsessed with the physical defense of lines drawn on a map.
So let me get this straight. We have the emotional regulation of a caveman being managed by the bureaucratic systems of a medieval king.
Yes, that's exactly it. And if the equation stopped there, human history would just be a continuous loop of localized, brutal, but ultimately survivable conflicts.
Men with swords fighting over hills.
Right. The existential threat arises with the third variable, godlike technology.
This is where it gets scary.
In just the last century, our technological capacity has just exploded. We went from the Wright brothers struggling to keep a wooden glider in the air to dropping atomic bombs that can erase cities in just over 40 years.
40 years. That is insane when you say it out loud.
We have hypersonic missiles, weaponized drones, bioengineered pathogens. The technology has planetary scale consequences now.
You know, the analogy that immediately came to mind reading this, and it's a dark one, to be honest, but it feels accurate, is that our current societal architecture is exactly like handing a loaded, high-caliber handgun to a toddler. I mean, the power of the tool is absolute. It can permanently end life. But the emotional regulation, the foresight, the moral framework required to understand the permanence of that action.
It's entirely non-existent in the toddler.
Exactly. That captures the danger perfectly. A toddler operates entirely on impulse, on immediate desire, or sudden fear.
And those are the Paleolithic emotions driving the system.
Right. The toddler doesn't understand the mechanics of the gun, only that pulling the trigger causes a loud noise and makes the immediate obstacle go away.
And the preamble takes this diagnosis of our societal toddlerhood a step further. It points out a glaring collective hypocrisy in our modern morality.
Yeah, it describes this as the infantilism of our conscience. And I want you, listening right now, to really think about your own daily habits when we discuss this. Think about how you consume information.
The cognitive dissonance the text highlights here is profound.
It really is. The text observes that the modern world universally claims to value human life. We pride ourselves on human rights. In every functioning society on Earth, if an individual walks down the street and commits premeditated murder, society universally condemns it.
Absolutely. It's an abhorrent, unforgivable crime.
We dedicate massive resources to investigating it, prosecuting it, locking the perpetrator away. If you saw a news alert about a local murder right now, you would likely feel a visceral sense of disgust and tragedy.
And this is where the moral infantilism really reveals itself. If a state or a government commits mass murder through the apparatus of war, our collective reaction is entirely different.
It's completely different. We suddenly change our vocabulary. We compartmentalize the violence.
We don't even call it murder anymore.
No. We call it geopolitics. We call it collateral damage.
Or the price of security.
Or a necessary intervention. We sanitize it completely. You can scroll past a headline about a drone strike that killed 30 people halfway across the world, and your brain barely registers the horror because it has been categorized under foreign policy rather than mass murder.
Exactly. The preamble argues that this specific cognitive dissonance is the truest indicator of our moral infantilism. We have developed complex legal and ethical frameworks to govern individual behavior, but we allow nation-states to operate in a state of ethical anarchy.
It's madness.
We allow governments to use caveman logic. They have resources. We want them, therefore we attack, while wielding godlike weapons.
And the text warns that if this gap between our technological supremacy and our moral infancy isn't closed, the math inevitably results in the extinction of our species.
It's a bleak equation.
Hold on, though. I have to push back here. Because this diagnosis, while incredibly compelling, it feels like it's backing us into a deeply pessimistic corner.
How so?
Well, if our brains are literally running on Paleolithic, Savannah-optimized hardware, aren't we just violent apes by default?
I see where you're going.
I mean, if our neurochemistry is hardwired for tribalism and in-group, out-group violence, then this whole mismatch sounds like biological determinism. Is the preamble essentially saying we are fundamentally flawed animals and we are doomed unless we can somehow genetically engineer the caveman out of us?
That is the exact trap the preamble anticipates. And honestly, it's a very common misinterpretation of evolutionary psychology.
Really?
Yeah. If you stop reading at the diagnosis of the mismatch, it does sound like cynical biological determinism. It sounds like war is just our natural state.
Right.
But the text pivots sharply here. It explicitly rejects the idea that we are fundamentally violent. In fact, it argues the exact opposite.
The opposite.
It posits that the systemic violence we see in the modern world is not our default setting. It is a profound corruption of our biology.
Okay, wait. A corruption of the biology, not the expression of it.
Precisely. And to prove this, the preamble shifts from diagnosing the disease to establishing an incredibly robust multidisciplinary foundation for the cure. It calls this foundation the common heritage of humanity.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
And what is fascinating is the disclaimer it makes right at the beginning of this section. The authors explicitly state that they are not trying to invent a new religion.
Right, they aren't writing new esoteric commandments or trying to launch some utopian cult.
No, they are claiming to stand on the shoulders of giants. They are synthesizing thousands of years of existing human wisdom and cutting-edge science to prove that peace, not war, is our actual measurable baseline.
And they break this heritage down into 4 distinct pillars. So let's really dig into the mechanics of these pillars, starting with the first one, spiritual wisdom.
The way the text unites global theology here is very deliberate. It draws a line connecting the ancient Eastern concept of ahimsa.
That's the Sanskrit principle of non-injury, right?
Exactly. Profound compassion and nonviolence toward all living things. It connects that directly to the Western biblical commandments, specifically, thou shalt not kill.
Wow, so spanning the globe.
Yes. It points out that across completely disparate geographies and cultures, the highest spiritual traditions reach the exact same conclusion regarding violence.
But the preamble reframes thou shalt not kill, doesn't it? It moves it away from being just a cosmic speed limit.
It does. Often we view religious commandments as behavioral boundaries imposed by an angry authority figure. Don't do this or you will be punished.
Right, fear-based.
The preamble argues that this is a shallow reading. It posits that these spiritual tenets are actually a profound recognition of the intrinsic, sacred, and inviolable nature of life itself.
I love that.
It's not just a rule to keep society orderly, it's an acknowledgement that life possesses a metaphysical weight that cannot be casually extinguished for political gain.
Okay, so that establishes the spiritual bedrock. The second pillar shifts the language entirely from theology to philosophical humanism.
Right.
It brings up the golden rule, doing unto others as you'd have them do to you. But it grounds its argument heavily in the work of Immanuel Kant, specifically his categorical imperative.
And this is where the preamble gets real teeth in its critique of modern statecraft.
Walk us through the Kantian angle for those who might not spend their weekends reading 18th century Prussian philosophy.
Fair enough. So Kant argued that human beings possess an inherent, unquantifiable dignity. Because of this dignity, a human being must always be treated as an end in themselves, and never merely as a means to an end.
Let's apply that directly to the concept of war, because this completely dismantles the logic of a military draft.
It dismantles the entire logic of geopolitical conflict.
How so?
Well, when a political leader or a general decides to send 50,000 young men and women to a battlefield to secure a disputed border, or to gain control of an oil field, or simply to project strength to a rival superpower, what are they actually doing?
They are fundamentally treating those human lives as a means.
Exactly. They are using people as tools, as expendable resources, as literal human currency to purchase a political end.
They are weighing human lives against geopolitical objectives on a spreadsheet.
Yes. And the preamble uses Kantian humanism to declare that this calculation is not just tragic, it is inherently, objectively unethical. A human life is the ultimate end. It possesses infinite value. Therefore, it cannot be mathematically weighed against finite geopolitical gains.
You cannot ethically justify the destruction of an end to achieve a means.
Precisely.
So we have the spiritual and the philosophical pillars. But pillar 3 is where this preamble really hooked me, because it moves away from the abstract and brings in the hard data.
Yes, scientific rationalism.
Right. And what's brilliant is that it uses evolutionary biology to completely flip the cynical survival of the fittest narrative on its head.
The popular, incredibly simplified misunderstanding of Darwinian evolution is that it is purely a ruthless, bloody competition.
Nature red in tooth and claw.
Right. The strong eat the weak, the winner takes all, and therefore human warfare is just the macro expression of natural selection.
Which is the exact argument every cynical dictator has used for the last century.
It's a very convenient excuse for atrocity, but the preamble completely bypasses that elementary reading and dives into the concept of symbiogenesis.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Yeah, it's a theory deeply associated with the evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis. Symbiogenesis demonstrates that the most significant leaps in the complexity of life on Earth did not occur through competition, but through profound cooperation.
Right, the merging of cells.
Exactly. Billions of years ago, you had separate, independent, single-celled organisms. Instead of one destroying the other, they merged.
They just teamed up.
One engulfed the other but didn't digest it. They formed a symbiotic relationship where both benefited, eventually creating complex eukaryotic cells. I mean, the mitochondria in our cells right now, energy factories of our bodies, were once independent bacteria.
Oh, wow.
Complex life itself is the result of ancient biological peace treaties. Cooperation is literally baked into our cellular architecture.
So the idea that evolution is solely driven by the strong dominating the weak is, well, biologically illiterate.
It ignores the actual mechanics of how complexity arises. And as species evolved from single cells to complex mammals to early hominids, this mechanism scaled up.
Okay, so how does that apply to humans on the savannah?
The preamble argues that empathy and complex cooperation became humanity's ultimate evolutionary advantage. If you had a tribe of early humans, and they were entirely composed of selfish, aggressive, hyper-competitive individuals.
They would constantly be fighting over resources.
Exactly. They wouldn't care for their sick. They wouldn't share food effectively.
They would fracture and die out the first time a drought hit.
Precisely. But a tribe that developed neurological mechanisms for empathy, a tribe that collaborated to hunt large game, that cared for injured members so they could heal and contribute again, that shared knowledge across generations, that tribe thrived.
So empathy wasn't a biological weakness.
No, it was the ultimate survival technology. It was the glue that allowed us to build civilization.
Which flows perfectly in the fourth and final pillar, the anthropological norm. This is where the preamble drills down into the actual neurochemistry and psychology of a normal human being. It claims that humans, and especially children, in their natural developmental state, possess a profound physiological aversion to violence.
And it backs this up by explaining the mechanics of mirror neurons.
The mirror neuron stuff is fascinating. Can you break that down?
Sure. The discovery of mirror neurons in the 1990s by Giacomo Rizzolatti and his team fundamentally changed how we understand empathy. These are a specific class of neurons located primarily in the premotor cortex that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that exact same action.
Wait, so if I reach out and grab a cup of coffee, A specific neural pathway lights up in my brain.
Right.
But if I sit perfectly still and watch you grab a cup of coffee, that exact same pathway lights up in my brain, simulating the action.
Exactly. Your brain is literally mirroring my behavior, and this applies profoundly to emotional states and pain. Yeah. If you see someone accidentally slice their hand with a knife, you will likely flinch. You might grab your own hand. You feel a sudden visceral jolt in your stomach.
I'm feeling it right now just thinking about it.
Right. That isn't just a metaphor. That is your mirror neurons physically simulating the pain you are witnessing. We are neurologically hardwired to experience the suffering of others.
Our brains literally map the pain of the other onto our own nervous system.
We dissolve the boundary between self and other at a neurological level.
That is incredible.
The preamble pairs this hard neuroscience with the concept of biophilia, a term popularized by E.O. Wilson.
Biophilia, right, love of life.
Exactly. It's the innate, biologically driven affinity that humans have for other living systems. It's why we are drawn to nature, why we keep pets, why a baby will instantly focus on a human face. We have an internal biological compass pointing toward connection and the preservation of life.
And it is worth noting here that the preamble expands its definition of life across all these pillars.
Yes, it isn't just anthropocentric.
Right. It explicitly states that this sacredness, this Kantian dignity, and this biophilia extend beyond just humans to include all sentient beings and the integrity of entire ecosystems. It presents a deeply interconnected, holistic view of planetary existence.
So when you synthesize these four pillars, the preamble has essentially constructed an impenetrable fortress of logic.
It really has.
You can't just wave it away as religious idealism because they bring the neuroscience of mirror neurons to back it up. You can't dismiss it as cold, calculating biology because they bring Kantian philosophy and spiritual wisdom to provide the moral weight.
It unites theology, philosophy, evolutionary biology, and neuroscience into a single, cohesive argument. Peace is our baseline.
Precisely.
Okay, the architecture of this argument is beautiful, but I have to interrupt this philosophical harmony.
Oh, here we go.
Because I am looking at this elegant, multidisciplinary proof that humans are biologically wired for peace. And then I am opening a history book. And the disconnect is massive.
It's the elephant in the room.
It's a huge elephant. If symbiogenesis makes us inherently cooperative, and mirror neurons make it physically painful for us to watch others suffer, and biophilia draws us toward life,
Right.
how do you explain the trenches of World War I?
Right.
How do you explain the Holocaust? How do you explain the relentless industrial-scale slaughter that makes up human history? If peace is our neurological norm, why is war the defining feature of our civilization?
That is the ultimate stress test for this preamble's philosophy, and the authors do not shy away from it.
How do they reconcile it?
They anticipate this exact objection with a very specific and frankly tragic caveat. The text argues that peace, empathy, and cooperation remain our biological norm until that norm is systematically broken by trauma or propaganda.
Broken by trauma or propaganda.
Yes.
That implies that violence requires an external force to activate it on a mass scale.
It implies that mass violence is incredibly unnatural. The preamble is arguing that you cannot simply hand a normal human being a rifle and tell them to slaughter strangers.
Because their biology fights it.
Exactly. Their mirror neurons will rebel. Their biophilia will rebel. To get a human being to override their physiological aversion to murder, you have to break their psychological immune system.
Wow.
You have to subject them to profound generational trauma, or you have to inundate them with highly engineered systemic propaganda.
You essentially have to short-circuit the mirror neurons.
Precisely. And how does propaganda do that? By dehumanizing the other. If the state can convince you through relentless messaging that the people across the border aren't actually human, that they are vermin, that they are monsters, that they are an existential threat to your children, then your brain stops categorizing them as fellow humans.
The mirror neurons fail to engage.
The empathy is neurologically bypassed.
You know, we know this is true even in modern military training.
Oh, absolutely.
After World War II, the military realized that a massive percentage of frontline soldiers intentionally fired over the heads of the enemy because they just couldn't bring themselves to shoot another human being.
Their biological aversion was too strong.
Right. So the military had to revolutionize training. They stopped using bullseye targets and started using human-shaped silhouettes that popped up unexpectedly.
Operant conditioning?
Exactly. They had to condition the soldiers through intense repetition to bypass the conscious, empathetic brain and rely purely on muscle memory. They had to scientifically engineer the empathy out of them in that split second.
Which perfectly proves the preamble's point. War is not an expression of human nature. It is the deliberate, systemic exploitation and manipulation of human nature.
We are not inherently violent.
We are inherently vulnerable to manipulation.
Wow. That is a massive structural paradigm shift. Because if you accept that premise that war is not a biological inevitability, but a systemic infection caused by trauma and propaganda, then the solution cannot just be a philosophical awakening.
No, a systemic problem requires a systemic architectural solution.
And that brings us to the operational core of this deep dive. Having laid down this immense philosophical and biological bedrock, the preamble pivots sharply.
It really does.
And you, the listener, are going to appreciate this transition because we are moving from the clouds of theory down to the cold, hard dirt of execution. The authors know that quoting Kant does not stop a drone strike.
Unfortunately not.
Understanding symbiogenesis does not dismantle a nuclear warhead. So, how does this document propose we actually operationalize this biology? How do we build this conscious evolution?
It starts by issuing a surprisingly blunt critique of past peace movements.
I was a little shocked by this part, honestly.
The preamble acknowledges that for centuries, incredibly well-intentioned people have campaigned for peace, and largely they have failed to stop the machinery of war. The text identifies 3 specific reasons for this failure: weak marketing, amateur organization, and a fundamental lack of scalability.
Weak marketing and amateur organization. It is so jarring to read those corporate terms applied to the concept of world peace.
It is, but it's intentional.
When I think of traditional peace movements, I picture something very sincere but structurally weak. I picture well-meaning people forming acoustic drum circles in a park, holding up hand-painted signs.
Right.
The energy is beautiful, the moral compass is entirely correct, but they have absolutely zero leverage. A drum circle is never going to disrupt the global supply chain of a military-industrial complex.
That analogy perfectly captures the frustration embedded in the preamble. The authors are saying that we have been treating the most complex existential threat to our species as a weekend hobby for activists.
Well, a weekend hobby.
What this preamble proposes is entirely different. It advocates for what it calls enterprise-grade peacebuilding.
Enterprise-grade.
It wants to build a multinational, fiercely organized, data-driven entity that operates with the ruthlessness and efficiency of a Silicon Valley tech giant, but whose tangible product is global peace.
They want to be a next-generation high-tech NGO. Let's dissect how they plan to achieve that, because the preamble breaks this enterprise-grade approach down into 4 specific operational protocols.
Let's do it.
Protocol number 1 focuses on the platform. The text states they intend to create an open-source social operating system. What does that actually look like in practice?
The terminology is vital here. They aren't writing a textbook. They are building an operating system. Think of it like a GitHub for sociology and conflict resolution.
Okay.
It means aggregating the absolute best scientifically validated pedagogical practices from around the globe, how to mediate tribal disputes, how to teach cognitive behavioral therapy to traumatized populations, how to implement critical thinking curriculums that inoculate children against propaganda.
And they put all this in one place.
They take all these tools, digitize them, and make them entirely open source. Anyone in any community on Earth can download this software, adapt it to their local cultural context, and run it.
Which flows immediately into Protocol 2, scale and quality.
Yeah.
Because having an open source library is useless if the people who need it most can't access or understand it.
Exactly.
And this is where the document leans heavily into technology, specifically mentioning the utilization of AI and big data.
If you drop a highly complex sociological toolkit regarding trauma resolution into a conflict zone in South Sudan or a fractured neighborhood in the Middle East, it will fail if it is written in academic English.
Yeah, the cultural context will be wrong, the idioms will be wrong.
The preamble proposes using advanced artificial intelligence and large language models to instantly translate, adapt, and localize these complex concepts into dozens of dialects, ensuring the psychological nuance is preserved.
So they are using the massive computational power usually reserved for optimizing targeted advertising algorithms and pointing it directly at conflict de-escalation.
Exactly. And they use big data to map the conflict. Where are the ideological pressure points? Which demographic is most susceptible to the propaganda right now? You deploy the AI-adapted educational tools to those specific nodes in the network with surgical precision.
Okay, this brings us to Protocol 3, And for me, this is the most revolutionary and controversial part of the entire preamble: measurability and standards.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting.
The text insists on applying strict corporate standards to the implementation of peace. It specifically name drops ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance, and SROI, which stands for social return on investment. It even proposes the creation of a dehumanization index.
This completely upends how traditional NGOs operate. Historically, the nonprofit world relies on emotional appeals and vague metrics.
Right. You donate money, they build a school or host a workshop, and they send you a picture of smiling children.
It's emotionally satisfying, but it's incredibly difficult to measure the actual systemic impact. How do you quantify doing good? The preamble violently rejects that ambiguity. It demands that peace builders guarantee donors and governments transparent, mathematically verifiable results.
Let's really pull this apart because I want to know how the mechanism actually works. Let's start with the dehumanization index. How do you mathematically measure hatred in a society? You can't just stick a thermometer into a city and see if the genocide temperature is rising.
You can't use a physical thermometer, but in the era of big data, you can build a semantic one.
A semantic thermometer.
A dehumanization index would likely rely on natural language processing algorithms constantly scraping open source data. Local social media feeds, regional news broadcasts, political speeches, online forums.
Looking for what, specifically?
Looking for linguistic shifts. We know from studying the horrific lead-ups to events like the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust that mass violence doesn't just spontaneously happen.
Right, there's a buildup.
It is preceded by a very specific, measurable shift in language. The targeted outgroup slowly stops being referred to by their names or professions, and the propaganda begins using biological or sanitation metaphors.
Oh, God.
They become rats, cockroaches, vermin, tumors, or infections that need to be cleansed.
Because that language directly targets and disables the mirror neurons we talked about earlier.
Precisely. A dehumanization index would quantify that semantic shift in real time. If the algorithm detects a 30% spike in the use of disease metaphors directed at a specific ethnic group on regional social media, the index flashes red.
It acts as an early warning radar for atrocities.
And because the NGO operates like a tech company, that red alert immediately triggers the deployment of counter-messaging, mediators, and the open-source de-escalation tools we mentioned in Protocol 1 before the first shot is ever fired.
That is incredible. And what about SROI, social return on investment? How do you calculate the financial return of a war that didn't happen?
It requires complex economic modeling, but it is entirely possible. If you invest $10 million into a peace-building and mediation initiative in a volatile region, and that initiative successfully prevents a localized civil conflict, you can calculate the SROI.
Ow.
You calculate the cost of the infrastructure that was not bombed. You calculate the cost of the refugee crisis that was averted. You calculate the decades of healthcare costs for wounded veterans that the state will no longer have to pay.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, that $10 million investment yields a verified, multi-billion-dollar return retained societal value. You prove to governments that peace is not just morally right, it is economically superior.
Which leads to Protocol 4, the network. To execute all of this, the preamble describes a social franchise model. It wants to empower local leaders in a decentralized ecosystem.
Think of how a massive fast food chain operates. McDonald's doesn't run every single restaurant from a single corporate office.
Right. They use a franchise model.
They provide the exact blueprint, the supply chain logistics, the branding, and the quality control standards. But a local owner operates the physical store because they understand the local community.
But applied to peacebuilding.
Exactly. The NGO provides the open source platform, the AI tools, the dehumanization index software, and the SROI auditing framework. But the actual peace centers are owned and operated by local community leaders, teachers, and mediators who understand the cultural nuances intimately. It is decentralized execution paired with rigorous centralized quality control.
Okay, I have to stop and play devil's advocate here.
So,
Because I understand the brutal efficiency of this model. It is a masterpiece of organizational design. But can we really quantify something as profoundly abstract, as deeply spiritual and human as peace using the language of corporate spreadsheets?
it's a risk, for sure.
Doesn't apply big data, ESG algorithms, and return on investment metrics to a moral imperative run the massive risk of losing the very humanity we are trying to save? Do we risk turning peace into just another optimized financial derivative? Does the spreadsheet kill the biophilia?
It is the most valid critique you could level at a technocratic approach to sociology. If you become obsessed with the metrics, you risk losing the mission. You start optimizing for the algorithm rather than the human being.
Exactly.
However, I believe the authors of the preamble would argue that the metrics are not the piece itself. They are simply the scaffolding necessary to build it at scale.
The scaffold.
Yes. You need the ruthless efficiency of the spreadsheet to ensure that the philosophical humanism and the empathy are actually reaching the millions of people who need it, rather than just evaporating into the ether as good intentions.
The metrics are the delivery mechanism, not the payload.
Exactly. Without the rigor of measurement and scalability, you inevitably revert back to the acoustic drum circle. Everyone feels wonderful, the poetry is beautiful, but the systemic violence continues unabated. The corporate framework is simply the armor that allows empathy to survive on a global battlefield.
That makes a lot of sense. The spreadsheet is the vehicle. But even if we build this perfect enterprise-grade vehicle, even if we have the AI translators, the social franchises, the dehumanization index, and the perfect open-source curriculum, we were still facing an insurmountable psychological hurdle.
The biggest hurdle of all.
We are trying to convince a global population of 8 billion people who have been steeped in the inevitability of war for millennia to simply give it up. It feels like trying to convince a fish to fundamentally redefine water.
It is the ultimate bottleneck of human progress. And the authors of the Manifesto are acutely aware of it, which is why the final section of our deep dive focuses entirely on the mechanics of rewriting reality.
Rewriting reality.
The preamble doesn't just offer the tools, it provides a sociological roadmap for countering the profound skepticism of the masses.
The preamble issues a call to awaken our collective moral imagination. It demands that we make a global, existential choice. We must collectively define a world without murder, a world without war, as the norm. Not as a utopian dream, not as a temporary ceasefire, but as the unbreakable baseline of human existence.
And it grounds this massive psychological ask on two distinct pillars of history and sociology.
Let's look at the first one, historical precedent. The text makes the argument that the eternal laws of human evil are, in fact, entirely reversible.
This is a deeply comforting and compelling historical argument. The text explicitly points to institutions like chattel slavery, systemic torture, and ritual human sacrifice.
Things that used to be everywhere.
Exactly. If you and I were having this conversation 1,000 years ago or even 400 years ago, in almost any civilization on Earth, the concept of a global economy without slavery or a religion without sacrifice would have been literally unthinkable.
Right. If I stood up in the town square in the year 1600 and said, I envision a world where no human being can own another, I wouldn't just be called an idealist.
You'd be called crazy.
I would be called a lunatic who doesn't understand basic economics or human nature. People would say, slavery has existed since the dawn of time. It is how empires are built. It is an immutable fact of reality.
They defined it as an eternal law, but those institutions were abolished. And they didn't disappear because human DNA suddenly mutated.
No.
They didn't disappear because we evolved into a new biological species. They disappeared because there was a profound, agonizing, but relentless shift in ethical norms. Society actively awoke its moral imagination.
We collectively redefined those practices. We moved them from the category of necessary economic evils into the category of unacceptable, grotesque atrocities.
Once the moral definition changed, the physical institutions eventually collapsed under the weight of that new reality.
The preamble is boldly drawing a direct historical line. It is claiming that the institution of war is not a biological necessity. It is simply the next cultural institution on the historical chopping block of abolished evils.
It frames war not as an eternal curse, but as an obsolete technology of dispute resolution that we must outgrow, just as we outgrew trial by combat or human sacrifice.
That is an incredibly audacious claim. But the preamble doesn't just rely on looking backward at history. It relies on the mechanics of sociology to explain how that shift happens. And this is the second pillar of their argument for rewriting reality.
The Thomas Theorem.
Yes, it introduces a concept called the Thomas Theorem, also known as the law of defining reality.
The Thomas Theorem is a foundational principle in sociology, articulated by W.I. Thomas and Dorothy Swain Thomas in 1928. The theorem is elegant in its simplicity, but terrifying in its implications.
What is it exactly?
It states, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences.
If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Let's chew on the mechanics of that. How does the preamble apply that theorem directly to the existence of war?
It applies it by identifying our current belief in the inevitability of war as a massive, civilization-level, self-fulfilling prophecy. Right now, the global community, our political leaders, and our media all define war as an inevitable reality.
Right.
Because we define it as real and inevitable, what actions do we take?
We prepare for it constantly.
Exactly. We build gargantuan defense industries. We allocate trillions of dollars to military budgets instead of education or infrastructure. We write foreign policy based entirely on mutual distrust and deterrence. We hoard nuclear weapons. We train generations of young people to be soldiers.
The entire architecture of our global society is structurally built around the assumption that a war will inevitably happen.
Yes.
And because we have spent trillions of dollars building the stage for a war, and we have hired the actors, and we have manufactured the props, and we've written the script, eventually the play gets put on.
The consequence of the war becomes a physical reality, primarily because we define the situation as real to begin with and acted accordingly. Precisely. If Nation A and Nation B define each other as inevitable enemies, Nation A will build up its military to protect itself. Nation B sees this buildup, defines it as an aggressive threat, and builds up its own military in response.
Nation A sees Nation B's response, validating its original fear, and the cycle accelerates.
The Thomas Theorem perfectly illustrates how a collective psychological belief physically manifests the exact reality it is afraid of.
So the ultimate goal of the Preamble, using all this enterprise-grade technology and open-source platforming, is to use the Thomas Theorem in reverse.
Exactly. They want to engineer a deliberate shift in what political scientists call the Overton Window.
The Overton Window being the range of policies or ideas that are considered politically acceptable to the mainstream population at any given time.
Right. Currently, the idea of a completely demilitarized, peaceful world sits far outside the Overton Window. It is viewed as radical, utopian, or dangerously naive.
The Preamble aims to meticulously shift that window until the definition of peace without murder moves from radical to acceptable, and eventually to the unquestioned baseline norm.
If we can collectively redefine peace as the inevitable reality, we will start building institutions, budgets, and policies that guarantee peace, making it a self-fulfilling prophecy in the positive direction.
It is about changing the baseline assumption of the human operating system. You know, the analogy that captures the psychology of this perfectly is the story of the 4-minute mile.
Oh, that's a great example.
For decades in the early 20th century, the greatest sports experts, doctors, and elite athletes universally believed that running a mile in under 4 minutes was a biological impossibility.
They defined that limitation as an absolute reality.
They really did. Medical journals published papers stating that the human heart would literally explode if you pushed the body that hard. It was an unquestioned law of nature.
And because the entire athletic world believed it was impossible, no one trained quite hard enough to break the barrier. Their belief literally created the physical limitation in their performance.
Exactly, the Thomas Theorem in action. But then, in 1954, Roger Bannister ran the mile in 3 minutes and 59.4 seconds. He didn't just break a world record on a track. He shattered a collective psychological illusion.
He shifted the Overton window of what human biology was capable of.
And what happened next is the most crucial part of the story. Within just a few years, dozens of other runners were breaking the 4-minute mile. High schoolers started breaking it.
Human physiology didn't suddenly evolve in 3 years. Their bodies were exactly the same.
What changed was their definition of reality. Once they knew it was possible, once the psychological barrier was removed, the self-fulfilling prophecy of limitation vanished. The Preamble is essentially asking humanity to be the Roger Bannister for global peace.
To run the 4-minute mile of abolishing state-sanctioned murder.
Yes. Once we prove the impossible is possible, it rapidly becomes the standard.
It is a stunning analogy. It really highlights that our greatest limitations are often psychological, not physical.
I do have one final pragmatic pushback here, though.
Okay, let's hear it.
Comparing the abolition of war to running a faster mile, or even to the abolition of human sacrifice, is a massive leap.
It is.
Was human sacrifice just a cultural, religious invention that we eventually intellectually outgrew? Whereas war is tied to something much deeper, like absolute physical survival and resource scarcity.
That's the classic realist argument.
If two nations are facing a devastating drought, and they are literally running out of water, is simply shifting the Overton window and changing our definition of reality really enough? You can't meditate away a lack of water. Does the Thomas Theorem override a physical fight for survival?
That is the ultimate pragmatic crucible for this entire document. And if pressed, the authors of the preamble would likely refer back to the synergy of their earlier sections to answer this. They would argue that in the modern world, even resource scarcity is overwhelmingly a problem of distribution, political leverage, and a lack of cooperation, rather than an absolute planetary lack.
Right, we have enough food to feed everyone, we just throw a third of it away or can't get it across hostile borders.
Exactly. And this is where the enterprise-grade technology comes in. If we took the trillions of dollars and the massive AI computational power currently dedicated to weapons development and threat modeling and redirected it toward optimized resource management, desalination technology, and agricultural logistics, the scarcity driving the conflict could be mathematically mitigated.
The preamble makes a very stark statement. Ethics is not an abstraction, but a fundamental law of survival.
Yes.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning that in a world governed by the Promethean gap, where we possess godlike, civilization-ending weapons, fighting over a shrinking water supply ensures that both sides will inevitably deploy those weapons, and both sides will die.
It's mutually assured destruction.
Therefore, sifting the Overton window to enforce absolute cooperation isn't just a nice psychological trick or a moral luxury. It is the only mathematically viable survival strategy left to us. We either redefine our reality to force cooperation, or our medieval institutions and godlike weapons guarantee we perish together. The choice is binary.
Wow. We have traversed an immense intellectual landscape today. Let's try to pull all of these threads together and summarize the core architecture of this incredible journey through the preamble.
It's been a lot to process.
For you listening, think about the sheer scope of the argument we've just walked through. The text didn't start with platitudes. It started by ruthlessly diagnosing our Promethean gap and our evolutionary mismatch, the terrifying reality that we are navigating a world of nuclear weapons and AI using the emotional threat responses of cavemen, governed by the territorial bureaucracies of medieval kings.
It forced us to confront our own moral infantilism, where we condemn a murder in our neighborhood but shrug at the mass murder of geopolitics.
And from that dark diagnosis, it built a foundation of profound hope. It grounded us in the common heritage of humanity, weaving together spiritual inviolability, Kantian philosophy, the evolutionary mathematics of symbiogenesis, and the hard neuroscience of mirror neurons.
It proved that empathy and cooperation are actual biological baselines, and that the violence we see is a systemic infection caused by trauma and the deliberate dehumanization of propaganda.
And, having established that baseline, it abandoned the acoustic drum circles of the past. It laid out a blueprint for a ruthless, enterprise-grade, high-tech NGO. It proposed open-source operating systems for sociology, utilizing AI to translate de-escalation tactics, and holding the entire endeavor accountable to corporate metrics like SROI and a real-time dehumanization index.
It demanded we treat peacebuilding with the exact same logistical rigor we apply to global supply chains.
Finally, it challenged us to confront the Thomas Theorem. It demanded that we awaken our moral imagination and realize that war is only inevitable because we continually define it as such, funding its existence through our collective belief.
It asked us to shift the Overton window and be the generation that abolishes war, just as previous generations abolished slavery.
It is a breathtaking, exhaustive blueprint. And there was one final, incredibly important nuance in the preamble that I think we must highlight before we wrap up. The authors are deeply aware of the complexity of global belief systems. They explicitly state that this manifesto is not meant to be a strict dogma that replaces your existing worldview.
Yes, the inclusivity at the end of the text is a vital piece of the architecture. It describes itself as a root operating system, meant to seamlessly unite believers and atheists, traditionalists and progressives.
I thought that was a really smart move.
It explicitly notes that words like spirit, sacredness, or infinite value can be understood deeply through the lens of religious faith, or they can be understood equally deeply through the lens of secular philosophical conscience. It refuses to impose a specific metaphysics on the reader.
It simply says, whatever your cultural or philosophical operating system is, it must prioritize the inviolability of life above all else.
It is an invitation to collaborate, not a mandate to convert.
And for you, the learner, listening to this deep dive as you go about your day, I want to bring all of this massive global philosophy right back down to your level. Because this deep dive isn't just about global geopolitics happening in a UN building or a think tank somewhere.
No, not at all.
This is about how information, trauma, and societal norms construct the reality you walk through every single day.
It challenges you to look at how you process the Promethean gap in your own life. Where does your technological reach, the words you can blast out on social media, the systems you participate in, exceed your emotional grasp of their consequences?
Exactly. It asks you to examine how quickly you compartmentalize your own ethics and how easily you accept the unacceptable simply because the institutions around you have normalized it. So I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over. I want you to build right on that sociological concept we ended with, the Thomas Theorem.
It's a powerful tool.
We discussed how the massive, terrifying institution of war is largely a self-fulfilling prophecy, sustained because we collectively define it as a real and inevitable necessity. The machinery of war only continues to grind forward because we feed it with our assumption that it must exist.
Right.
So look closely at your own life. What other inevitable evils in your personal relationships, in your corporate workplace, or in your local community are only real because you and the people around you have simply agreed not to question them?
What toxic dynamics, what accepted limitations, what everyday cruelties have you accepted as just the way things are, when in reality, they're only there because you haven't yet dared to shift your own Overton window? It is a profound and uncomfortable question. We actively build the walls of our own realities every single day.
We really do. We define the limits of our world. Thank you to the listener for sharing such an exhaustively dense, incredibly thought-provoking document with us. Unpacking the architecture of this preamble has been an absolute journey. Until next time, keep questioning the reality you've been handed.